Okay, I'm recording, but it won't see any of your faces. Okay. Just mine, just my ugly face. All right. Boom. The first 2 years, biosocial development. Very exciting time. You know, my son is almost 1.5 years old. And so this lecture is particularly meaningful for me. By the end of the current lecture, what will we know? First, what part of an infant grows most in the first 2 years? Second, are babies essentially blind and deaf at birth? And third, what happens if a baby does not get their vaccinations? Okay. Just a moment. There we go. All right, let's talk about some body changes in the developing youngster. Up to year one, between year 0, year 1, birth weight doubles by the 4th month and triples by 1 year. There is a substantial variation, though. You know, we can't say it's exactly the same for everyone, as you know. My son definitely lived up to this. Typical newborn grows 10 inches by age 1. Average at birth, weight 7 pounds, it's about 2 kilos, length 20 inches. You know, there's variation in all of these things, as you understand already. I may have mentioned before, my brother-in-law had 2 twin daughters recently, and one was 3.5 pounds and one was 2 pounds. But they're okay now. Between year 1 and year 2, physical growth slows down a bit. And at age 2, did you know this? At age 2, you are 1/2 of your adult height, and you're 1/5 of your adult weight. Okay, a little bit more about body changes. Norms, you know, sort of expected parameters. Defined standards of typical performance. These represent average measurements, individuals vary. Okay, so when we say body weight doubles, triples, you're half your adult height, you know, again, these are norms, but we have a lot of variation. Okay, so let's define the term percentile. We hear this term a lot in education. It's a number that indicates someone or something's rank compared to other similar people of the same age or things. Percentiles range from 0 to 100. So you'll often hear things like, you know, my son is in the 80th percentile, something like that. Okay, so there are a number of different effects, age effects, time effects, nutritional effects, that you can look at and point to variation in developing children. But gender is a big one. So between birth to 2 years, 24 months, got a graph here of weight separated into girls and boys. Okay, and here's our term percentile right here. Okay, so in the 90th percentile for boys, the weight is about 31 pounds, something like that, 31, 32. For girls, I should have said. My boys is the dotted line, so about maybe 33, 32 and a half. Okay, and in all the way down to the 10th percentile for girls, it's around 22 and a half. For boys, it's around 23, something like that. Okay. These are 3 pictures of the same boy, much changed. Okay, I'm sure many of you have similar photos kicking around your camera. These are courtesy of a former student, Cecilia Vargas. And so we got baby at maybe just a few months, getting a crown of hair there, but still pretty close to birth. 1 year, 2 years. All right. Body changes part 3. Okay, let's talk about infant sleep and the patterns of same. Newborns average 15 to 17 hours a day. If they would do that all at one time, it would be great. But yeah, it's usually split up into sometimes small chunks, sometimes large. Over the early weeks, REM sleep, we'll talk more about that in a minute, and traditional sleep decline rapidly. Okay, so when we start out, got a lot of REM sleep going on, and then it reels back, it dials back a bit. Slow wave sleep increases. Okay, so slow wave is the type of, it's the type of sleep that we do the most. We'll come back to that. Okay, more about patterns of infant sleep.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, what is REM and slow rate? What does
So like I said, we'll come back to those.
Oh, okay.
There's
Thank
more about that in the lecture.
you. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, everybody. We're introducing like a lot of terms and everything, but we'll get deeper into them. All right. So we talked about norms and how, people don't conform to norms. I don't, you don't, right? But a norm is just an idea. It's just like an average. Individual differences, are seen in developing people due to maturation, genes, and environment. So in the last lecture, we talked about the interplay between nature and nurture. So nature would be the genes, environment would be the nurture, and environment has a whole host of variables. Right? Caregiver response to infant behavior during sleep hours also impacts sleep patterns. Okay, so people will often say, infants can cue into your stress if they see that you're stressed out. It makes them more stressed out. We'll talk about how much they can actually see, but there does seem to be evidence that there is correlation between our mood and their mood. Insufficient sleep may be a problem for parents and infant. No kidding. I bet you all knew that, right? Okay. We have the phenomenon known as co-sleeping. Co-sleeping is when parents and children, sleep in the same space. I've fallen asleep a few times with my son right here. This kind of thing. According to the data collected for this publication, Asian, Latin American, and African mothers worry more about separation, and European and North American mothers worry more about privacy and sex. Some cohort differences include these ones, pros and cons. Pros as far as co-sleeping go, quick response time, right? If the baby's having a problem, you can respond more quickly. And it's related to increased response attachment. So as the baby grows, the person develops, there seems to be more attachment, a measurable amount of attachment. I don't know how much, if co-sleeping occurs. And then cons, there's a higher risk of SIDS, which is sudden infant death syndrome. SIDS is something of a mystery to medical science, but there's correlation. We don't know if there's causation, but there's correlation between co-sleeping and SIDS and later sleep pattern problems. So, if you spend the first couple years of your life sleeping with the parent there, we had a phase with my son, or a couple of months, maybe 2 months, where he wouldn't fall asleep unless we put him between us and on the bed. Then how are you going to fall asleep later in life, right? When you're 6 years old, 7 years old, and you're scared of sleeping alone. Yeah. Okay, and the chart on the right shows us the estimated percent of co-sleeping. Okay, or body changes. Brain development. The brain is the fastest growing organ. Okay, that was one of the things that we promised that we would learn at the beginning. Brain growth affects later cognition, so it's really important to keep the brain fed. Overall nutrition has a huge impact on brain development. But there are so the next line says head despairing occurs when the body is physically challenged. So what this means is that the brain is able to sort of protect itself from nutritional deficiencies. So if other parts of the body are malnourished, the developing body can sort of prioritize the brain, because without the brain, nothing else is going to work, right? So it seems that evolutionarily, that has been a process that has been selected for in humans. So malnutrition is still a huge problem, right? A child never actually recovers from malnutrition later in life, but the body can protect itself from, sort of brain damage or different types of halted or delayed development in the brain. All right, within the brain, so many connections going on. A neuron is one of billions of nerve cells in the CNS, the central nervous system. Okay, so running all through brain, spinal column, which shields the nervous system. Communication with the central nervous system begins with neurons, and most of them are created before birth. So it's a funny thing. Brain cells, synapses, neurons, just like ova, are mainly there before you ever leave the womb. At a peak production rate of 250,000 new cells per minute in mid-pregnancy. Amazing. When we're infants, the human brain has billions of neurons already. So you can imagine billions of neurons, trillions of connections. Right? All right. If we look here on the right, we see this color-stained image, and it shows that the two cell bodies of neurons are joined via these axons and dendrites. This tangle is repeated thousands of times in every human brain, hence the trillions of connections I referred to. Throughout your life, those fragile dendrites will grow or disappear as the person continues thinking. I have certain theories about this. This is probably an appropriate time to talk about it. So, I'll tell you something that basically everyone in India and Africa already knows. Early bilingualism, multilingualism, is extremely beneficial to the human brain. So we find that when you're born with all of these neurons and everything that's trying to make connections, we'll talk about pruning in a minute, but every body process economizes, right? So we don't want to make more connections than we need, because then it takes more calories to keep us alive, more electricity is needed in the brain, all that kind of thing. So if we're exposed to only one language, then our pathways are wired in a certain way, you could call it wired, to discriminate against other sounds that are treated as non-linguistic by a monolingual speaker. And so certain pathways are never made. This is why it's easier when you're younger to learn many languages. Between the time you're born and the time you're 4, you can learn as many languages as you're exposed to. It's pretty amazing. In this country, the problem is that most people don't get that. Monolingualism is the norm here. Nowhere else, but just here. So those pathways need to be sort of created after the fact. And we know that that can't happen. So second language, third language acquisition at a later age is something that becomes more and more and more difficult as our brains have been sort of set to discriminate against the sounds of other languages as being non-linguistic noise. So that's just one phenomenon. That's just the one that I'm aware of because it's what I study. But there are several others like this. Okay, so defining some terms. Axons, we brought this up. It's a fiber that extends from a neuron and transmits electrochemical impulses from that neuron to the dendrites of the other neurons. You could think of the dendrites as fibers that extend from a neuron and receive. So they're kind of, receiving the transmission. They get the electrochemical impulses that are transmitted from other neurons via their axons. So axon is sending, dendrite is receiving. Synapses are the intersections between the axon of one neuron and the dendrites of other neurons. When these break down, this is one representation of a brain injury or brain damage. Neurotransmitter is a brain chemical that carries information from the axon of ascending neuron to the dendrites of a receiving neuron. So right here, just with these four terms, we have basically everything we need to know in terms of human development, about early brain development. Okay? We don't need to go any deeper. We don't need to learn about the chemistry, everything very specific like that. Just that messages are being sent. They're being sent by this process, received by this process, and liaised by this third process. All right, myelin is this sort of sheath that coats neurons, and it helps in transmission. You know, it's like when you look at the electric lines running across all of our city skies, they're coated with something. The actual electric line is pretty thin, but they all have this coating that shields them, and so it aids with transmission. Cortex is the outer layers of the brain where most thinking, feeling, and sensing occurs. You know, if we're being honest, the brain is still largely a mystery to us in this day and age, but we think that we have identified where most things happen, and the best way, unfortunately, the best way to identify this is by studying people who have had severe brain injuries, right? If you have an injury here, then you lose the ability to do this. Injury here, you lose this other ability, and so on. Okay. The prefrontal cortex is an area of the cortex, the very front of the brain, that specializes in anticipation, planning, and impulse control. Okay. And the limbic system. These are brain parts that interact to produce emotions, including amygdala, hypothalamus, and hippocampus. Okay, there will be no quiz, all right? We don't need to memorize all of these words, but if we do go on to study more human development, we'll be seeing them again. Hippocampus, okay? Hippocamp means seahorse, so it's sort of shaped like a curly tail of a seahorse. It's a central processor of memory, especially memory for locations. The hypothalamus responds to the amygdala and the hippocampus to produce hormones that activate other parts of the brain and body. Okay, you've probably heard of cortisol, primary stress hormone, whose fluctuations affect human emotions. And of course, the pituitary or pituitary gland responds to signals from the hypothalamus by hormone production. Each of these terms, if you do a cursory search on Google or another search engine to find out more about them, you'll learn that it's as I've said, damage to these different areas or underdevelopment in any of these areas leads to certain syndromes down the road in life. All right, cross-section of the brain. This would take a while to unpack. So if you do want to take a closer look at this, in the lecture slides, they'll be made available to you. Okay, so I said that we would talk about pruning and exuberance. So we mentioned that at birth, we have a whole bunch of neurons. In fact, it's an excess of neurons. And a newborn brain has fewer dendrites, axons, and synapses, and much less myelin than an adult brain. Well, why would that be? That's because the connections have yet to be made, right? You know, a child growing up, it's kind of like the process of limiting them. You know, they come out and they're wonderful and they just want to do everything, but we have to keep them from killing themselves many times a day. So we have to kind of limit the possibilities. The brain is kind of doing that too. And with my language example, I use the word discriminate, right? So the brain has to kind of say, okay, I need to economize, I need to make this many connections. And if I don't receive input that tells me to make more than just what is needed, I'm not going to do it. Okay. By the time we're adults, we have a lot of myelin sheathing because those connections have been more or less solidified. Exuberance is a great but temporary increase in the number of dendrites that develop in an infant's brain during the first 2 years of life. It's called transient exuberance because it's temporary. The unused dendrites, whether they're formed postnatally, they wither postnatally to allow space between neurons in the brain, allowing more synapses and more complex thinking. Okay, and we said that synapses were the connections between axons and neurons. All right. Okay, on to a little bit of nurture. Experience shapes the brain. Necessary and possible experiences based on research from Greenough and some colleagues. There is experience expectant brain function and experience dependent brain function. Okay, so we talked a minute ago about the brain being able to anticipate things that would relate to this. And experience dependent brain function, connections are made, right? Connections are made in the brain based on experiences that we have. That's why we have things like prejudice, and not the negative type of prejudice, but for example, I don't touch a hot stove because based on my experience, it's going to burn me, right? All right. Experience shapes the brain. Here are a couple of examples from language development studies. So it's kind of an analogy, but human babies learn language much like birds learn songs. Adults talk, and baby brains expect a culturally specific language. So this could be very much misinterpreted. We don't mean to say that a Chinese baby expects to learn Chinese, right? A French baby expects to learn French. That's not it at all. Again, it's that process of trimming of the brain saying, this is noise and this is language. So early multilingualism allows the brain to identify many more things as language than monolingualism does. Some examples from bird brains that are analogous: birds inherit genes that produce the brain cells they need to learn new songs or to find hidden seeds. So for the dendrites and neurons to connect in their brains, birds depend on specific experiences, right? So they have to hear the songs, or seed finding. So they have to see another bird finding a seed in a certain way, or a worm, or whatever that particular bird species eats. So these are learned behaviors. Right? Language development is the brain's response to input. And the bird being able to sing the specific song that will attract a mate, or being able to find a seed, is very similar. Okay, face recognition. If you asked me to tell you which of these monkeys is which, I couldn't help you. But this is a series of 6 named monkeys that were studied by Scott and Alexander Monison and published in 2010. Yep. All right, so face recognition seems to be a function of recognizing fusiform faces of the brain, which makes a newborn infant adapt at face recognition. Okay, so there is a process of the brain. When I say process, I mean group of body parts that work together, responsible for face recognition. Experiences that we have, such as seeing different faces, they refine our face perception. That data kind of goes in there. And so just like with language, if you're exposed to only one language, you're sort of hardwired to only accept the sounds of that language as language sounds. If you are similarly, if you are only exposed to one sort of set of facial templates, okay, for instance, you're raised around only Asian people or only white people or something, then it's harder to differentiate between the faces of people whose facial templates don't match those of your family, for example. And there's something called the own race effect. This is apparent before the first birthday and persists throughout life. Okay, this is another way of saying what I just detailed. Okay, we know that harm can come to the infant brain through malnutrition, but there are other ways that it can happen as well. Our brains need stimulation. You know, I'm sure all of us have heard of different cases where a child has been like shut in a closet and deprived of stimuli. They don't, unsurprisingly, they don't develop at normal rates, right, or near normal rates. So playing, allowing varied sensations, and encouraging movement are necessary for brain connections, right? So it's not just that the kids have a lot of energy and we want to send them out to recess, it's also necessary for their development. The brain can be overly stressed, and overabundance of stress hormones damages later brain functioning. So this is one of the ways in which malnutrition and maltreatment is something that our bodies and brains never really fully recover from. How about severe social deprivation? Again, the person locked in a closet. Anecdotal evidence with human children, so data from stories, and research with other mammals confirms that isolation and sensory deprivation harm the developing brain. Right? Why is it anecdotal evidence? Why is it data just from stories? Well, because you can't do an experiment like this, right? It would be incredibly unethical to intentionally take a child and isolate them from stimuli. So the learning that has been done is kind of based on these really negative circumstances that have happened to a few people per century. All right, intervention. This is an environmental factor. Shaken baby syndrome, probably heard of this. It's a life-threatening injury that occurs when an infant is forcefully shaken back and forth. This motion ruptures blood vessels in the brain and breaks neural connections. So at a time when all of those synapses are just striving to make those connections between the axons and neurons, if a person is shaken, then it makes it a lot harder. You can actually break those connections or prevent them from forming. And that's what shaken baby syndrome is. Okay. Perceiving and moving. Sensory development. So we've got at least 5 senses that we know of. And this typically happens before intellectual and motor development. Sensation, right? Feeling things. It's the response of a sensory system. We're defining our terms. Response of a sensory system like eyes, ears, skin, tongue, and nose when it detects a stimulus. So we often hear the word sensation used in a different way. A sensation as a feeling, right? Oh, that's a sweet sensation. Oh, that's a terrible sensation. But the action of sensation is what we're talking about here. And how about perception? It's the mental processing of sensory information when the brain interprets a sensation. Okay, so that sensation happens, travels to the brain, and gets processed, and that's called perception. Okay. We hear in stereo, right? Hearing occurs in the temporal lobe in both hemispheres. The green in the image here is temporal lobe, and some of the red parts of the brain are involved as well. Language comprehension, though, occurs mostly in the left hemisphere, shown here in the brown. Yeah, I guess we're calling this brown. That responds to known words, and Broca's area, the red bulb right here, that produces speech. Okay, so we have different types of aphasia. Yep, aphasia that happens. So I said earlier that one of the ways that we know how the brain works is that we've studied folks who have brain injuries. If there is an injury to Broca's area, then you get a certain type of aphasia. It's called Broca's aphasia, no surprise, that affects your language production. Injuries to other language centers of the brain affect your language perception. So those are some of the things that we have learned about language. Okay, we said before that perception follows sensation. The sensation happens, the brain interprets it as a perception. Infants' brains are especially attuned to their own repeated social experiences, and perception occurs. The infant brain and the auditory capacity to hear sounds in the usual are both in the usual speech range. The parts of the cortex dedicated to the senses develop rapidly. So in development, we're prioritizing sensation and later cognition, perception. All right, what about hearing? In our pre-test, we had some questions about this. Hearing develops during the last trimester of pregnancy. Have you ever heard anyone say that you should play music for your unborn baby? No, they'll appreciate it. No, only in the last dozen or so weeks. Would that be true? Hearing is the most advanced of a newborn's senses, and by 4 months after birth, the infant's able to perceive speech. Right? They'll perceive something as being speech, you could say. So we see the adoring father here looking at the baby's eyes. Baby's eyes aren't necessarily focusing on dad, but he's definitely listening. He or she is definitely listening. Okay, seeing. At birth, this is the least mature sense. Newborns can focus between 4 and 30 inches away, so about like that. And experience and maturation of the visual cortex improve shape recognition, visual scanning, and details. Okay, so taking in that data, that visual data, as well as the cortex maturing, improve our shape recognition. All right. At 3 months, binocular vision occurs. Okay, so we go from taking in sort of a broader swath of the visual spectrum to focusing in like this. Binocular vision, it sounds like a negative thing, right? But it's just what allows us to focus on something with both eyes. Okay, how about smell and taste? What is that, a pickle? It's like a pickle maybe that the child doesn't like. Smell and taste both function at birth, and they rapidly adapt to the social world. Okay, so, we often eat together, right? Even with the baby at the table. So babies become habituated to putting certain things in their mouth and other things not. Takes a while though. It's related to, smell and taste are also related to family and cultural preferences, okay? If you grow up smelling curry all the time, like in our house, curry smells normal to you, right? And this may have some sort of evolutionary function, but more studies need to be done. All right, touch. When we think of sensation, we often think of touch. Sense of touch is pretty acute in infants. Although all newborns respond to being securely held, like this, soon after they prefer specific touches. All right, what about pain? Poor baby. Pain and temperature are often connected to touch. Some people assume that even the fetus can feel pain. Others say that the sense of pain does not mature for a couple of years. You know, I used the example earlier of touching a hot stove, the brain gathering that data, experiential data, and saying, I won't do that again. But some kids just keep touching the hot stove. It takes a while. Many NICU units have adopted pain and stress reducing practices. Natal ICU, neonatal ICU. All right. What about gross motor skills? We'll talk. Yeah, I think you may be talking about this in your other course. Motor skills are learned abilities to move some part of the body in actions ranging from a large leap, you know, a big jump, to just a flicker of the eyelid. So gross in this case would mean, you know, large, big muscle groups, broad movements. Gross motor skills include physical abilities involving large body movements like walking and jumping. How does it develop? Cephalocaudal and proximodistal, all right, let's just say head down and center out direction is how they develop. Okay, so we start here, go down, start here, go out. Sitting, standing, crawling, walking backward, running, and jumping are included in gross motor skills. Here's a picture of a baby who is about 8 months old. She's already able to crawl. You know, my son again. My son skipped the whole slow crawling phase. As soon as he could crawl, it was just running. As soon as he could walk, it was just running. This baby will probably be walking before a year, and you know, my son was too, but these might be outside of the norm. Okay. There are a number of dynamic, you know, changing systems that underlie motor skills. Here are 3 interacting elements: muscle strength, brain maturation, and practice. Okay, so if a newborn or a baby who's a few months old is put into water, like a pool, they'll do sort of step-like movements. I don't know if you've ever seen this before, but they'll sort of step to try to swim. And but if you take that same baby and put them on land, they won't try to do stepping movements. And why is that? It's because the leg muscles are not developed enough, and frankly, the legs are too chubby for them to be able to support themselves, so they don't try. They go for the crawling. So it takes a lot of practice. All right. The most important experiences are perceived with interacting senses and dynamic systems. Okay, what is this saying? It's saying it takes a village, right? Different systems of the body interacting together, different senses, giving different data to the brain in real time, really fast, forming those connections. Sensations facilitate social interaction and comfort, right? By 6 months, infants are able to coordinate the senses as well. Okay, so I smell dinner, right? Or I hear mommy, or something like that. Okay. We've gone from gross motor skills to fine motor skills. These cover physical abilities involving small body movements, especially movements involving the hands and fingers, like drawing and picking up a coin. They're shaped by culture and opportunity. My son again, I just remember him trying to pick things up, and I just was remarking that his movements are so slow. I always thought that a baby would be faster, just getting into trouble at 1,000 miles an hour. But really, what he was trying to do is develop those fine motor skills. Okay, and we mentioned a little bit ago that social interaction has connections with sensation. So sensations and motor skills further these three goals: social interaction, comfort, and learning. How many people have seen a baby grab their toes? I think they all do it, right? It's amazing how we can do that at that age. And then as experience with walking increases, our hips sort of become more rigid and you're not able to do that anymore. This baby is really concentrating on being able to perform this task. She really wants to get at those feet. Okay, so as with everything else, there are cultural variations. All healthy infants develop skills in the same sequence, but the age of acquisition is what's different, when it happens. Different influences that vary include genes, cultural patterns, nutrition, caregiving patterns. So if we could put all of these things together, you could sort of point out the differences between kids that are raised vegan, for example, with no animal products, and kids that are raised with a lot of meat or dairy, stuff like that. You'll get different development based on those external factors. But the genes are almost exactly the same. Okay, so again and again in this class and in the companion class, we're talking about how difference is not deficit. Okay, we started out by saying there are norms and not everybody conforms to the norm. I would submit that nobody conforms to the norm, right? That we are all variants of the same species. So difference is not deficit. Difference is, in fact, strength. The slow development relative to local norms may indicate a problem that needs attention. Okay? So outside of a certain variation, then you might want to look at it. Okay, so infant mortality. Infant mortality has been decreasing and decreasing and decreasing in this country, which is great. But still, most child deaths occur in the first month. So here's the rate that I was referring to with my comment. Almost 100% of 1-month-olds live to adulthood. And these days, educated women have fewer, healthier children. So there's a lot, there's a lot to unpack there. We could say a lot more about that. But if you just look at trends, if we look at societal trends, I've got a visitor. Hey. No, it's okay. Está bien. Está bien. Just a little bit. I promise we'll have a break right after I'm done talking. Okay. All right. So if you look at some really rich developed nations, think Japan, think France, Denmark, I don't know, but lots of rich developed nations have declining birth rates, sometimes sharply declining. So it's sort of a societal trend in developed nations, okay? To make it about everyone, not just about the women, right? It's a societal thing. All right, we talked earlier about sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. This researcher named Beal found that almost all SIDS babies she studied were sleeping on their stomachs. Stomach sleeping is a proven replicated risk, according to this research. Other risks for SIDS include low birth weight.
Sorry to interrupt you, but if you could go the previous slide. So I saw this one statement, the last one, which says educated women have fewer healthier children. Can you explain this?
That's what I was saying. Was I wanted to take it from being just about the women to the context, the societal context. So in in super developed, rich nations such as Japan, such as France, the birth rate is declining and declining and declining. In the developing world, the birth rate is not declining, at least not at the same rate. So if we look at it from that perspective about the context and what's the trend. Okay, so for example, if your sister has 2 kids, then you're likely to have 2 kids. If your sister has 4 kids, you're more likely to have 4 kids, right? So that's the context that I'm talking about. Does that make
Sure.
sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, being male is a risk to your health. It's true for many reasons, but other risks for SIDS include low birth weight, being male, parents who smoke, soft blankets and pillows. I remember we didn't give my son a blanket for like a year. Bed sharing, right? Co-sleeping. Winter, the cold that comes with it. You really want to give the child some extra warmth when it's winter, and a variety of other abnormalities. There is what's called comorbidity in terms of SIDS. So meaning that most of these victims experience several of the risks, not just one. It's not just stomach sleeping. It's stomach sleeping and a soft pillow, right? That kind of thing. Okay. This is wonderful news from 1978 to 2015. SIDS deaths per 100,000 live births have just plummeted. If you look right here in these 4 years, we see a really dramatic change, and it's sort of leveling off there. So good news. All right. We need to talk about immunization. It's super important. So for 100 years, a polio vaccination has been required. For 100 years, a measles vaccination has been required. It's just something that is done when you're born in the United States. And as new diseases come out that we can control for, new immunizations become necessary. What they do is they prime the body's immune system to resist a particular disease. You guys know that. But it also contributes to reduced mortality and population growth. Over time, you get herd immunity. Herd immunity is not something that happens quickly, but over time it does. So, for example, cholera, right? The disease known as cholera. We eradicated it in the United States about 100 years ago. So it's not just that we're all vaccinated for cholera, it's that you never run into someone who has cholera, right? So that is a strong factor in reduced mortality. Smallpox, polio, and measles, these are ones that I was mentioning before. They've all been basically eradicated in the United States. Who are immunizations unsafe for? They can be unsafe for embryos that are exposed to rubella. Rubella is another voracious disease. Immunizations are not safe for newborns, right? And for people with compromised immune systems, because they interact with the immune system. If you have advanced HIV or a couple of other different diseases that are autoimmune, it's not a good idea to get a vaccine. But if you don't, they're quite safe. What are some problems with them? There's no effective vaccine for AIDS, for malaria, for cholera, for typhoid, and shigellosis. I'm not even sure what shigellosis is. Also, many rural areas of the world are not reached. So the United Nations recently, within the last decade, has come out with its sustainable development goals for the world. And one of them is there's a lot of great goals. Gender equality, no poverty, access to fresh water, right? Things like this. And another is to vaccinate people against things like polio. And progress was really being made until 3 years ago. 3 years ago, you guys know what happened. We got the worldwide pandemic, and it actually set that back about 10 years. So medical progress in developing nations has been set back by the pandemic. Economic development in developing nations has been set back 10 years by the pandemic. When, a few years ago, folks in developing nations were gaining inequality, it got set back. So that's what it means when it says many rural areas of the world are not reached. It's just hard to reach somebody who, needs to walk 20 miles on foot to get to their vaccination site. It's not fair. It's not fair that they can't be reached. All right, nutrition. So it's another nurture factor. For every infant disease, including SIDS, breastfeeding reduces the risk and malnutrition increases it, stunting growth of the body and the brain. Okay, not my opinion. These are based on empirical data. Breastfed babies are less likely to develop allergies, asthma, obesity, and heart disease. So that does seem to be more than correlation, it's causation. And as the infant gets older, the composition of breast milk adjusts to the baby's changing nutritional needs. I'm sure everybody here knows that already, right? When the infant is first born, the woman is lactating, there's colostrum in the milk, and then after a while, there's no more colostrum. Okay, there's a couple of different forms of malnutrition. There's a protein-calorie malnutrition. And that's a condition where a person doesn't get enough food, right? That's the kind that we all understand. And then there's stunting, which is the failure of children to grow to normal height for their age due to severe and chronic malnutrition. And wasting, the tendency for children to be severely underweight for their age as a result of malnutrition. And I've said a couple of times that these are things that stick with people. What are some of the effects of chronic malnutrition? Learning can suffer. Of course, it's hard to concentrate. You have an empty belly. Diseases also take a heavier toll on people who are malnourished. And sometimes you can get a disease just from being malnourished, such as marasmus and kwashiorkor. All right. Thank you for sticking with me for that. That was hopefully the longest lecture that we will do. All right.